No one saw the exact moment he stopped breathing. In the chaos of the ER, while doctors argued over which patient mattered more, a wounded Navy SEAL began choking in silence, forgotten on a corner stretcher. No one looked. No one listened. Except her. The nurse everyone treated as invisible, publicly humiliated minutes earlier by an arrogant doctor, was the only one who noticed the silence was wrong. Her hands, which had trembled under judgment only moments before, suddenly did not tremble at all. What she did in the next few seconds did not look like nursing training. It looked like war instinct. And when the other SEALs arrived and saw what she had done, one of them whispered a question that would change everything. Who the hell was that woman? If this story pulled you in, hit like, subscribe to Silent Badge's stories, and tell us in the comments who you think she really is, because the truth is coming, and it changes everything. Liberty Cross Trauma Institute sat 3 blocks from the lake, close enough that the wind off Erie cut through the ambulance bay every time the doors opened. Cleveland Winters did not forgive weakness, and neither did Dr. Marcus Reed. Marin Ellis had learned that lesson twice already this week. The first time was Monday, when he corrected her dosage calculation in front of 2 residents and called it a rookie mistake, even though her math had been right. The second time was this morning, less than an hour ago, when he pulled her aside in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3 and told her she looked lost, that she looked like she did not belong in a real hospital, that maybe she should transfer somewhere slower, somewhere easier, somewhere that matched her. She had said nothing. She had learned to say nothing. Her shoulders curved forward when she walked past the nurse's station. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on charts, on floors, on anything that was not a face. When Reed raised his voice near her, her hands trembled, just slightly, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. No one paid attention. That was the point. What none of them knew was that 6 years ago, those same hands had held pressure on a gunshot wound in the back of a moving vehicle, doing 60 miles an hour through hostile terrain, with no lights, no backup, and no room for error. What none of them knew was that the woman they called slow, careless, and out of her depth had once carried a call sign that made grown operators go quiet in briefing rooms. Phoenix. No one at Liberty Cross had ever heard that name. No one ever would unless something went very wrong. By 2 in the afternoon, the ER was already a wall of noise. A pileup on I-90 had sent 6 patients through the doors in under 20 minutes, and the waiting room outside trauma looked more like a battlefield triage tent than a hospital lobby. Reed moved through it like a man performing for an audience, loud, confident, correcting nurses within earshot of anyone who might be watching. Marin worked the far corner, where the newest arrival had been wheeled in 15 minutes earlier. He had come through a side transfer, quiet, unlisted, flagged only as a trauma patient from an undisclosed federal referral. No name on the board. Just a bed number and a warning to keep questions to a minimum. He was a big man, even lying down, with the kind of stillness that came from training, not weakness. Bruising along his ribs, a shoulder wrapped tight, vitals that looked stable enough for the chart, stable enough that 2 techs had already moved past him twice without a second look. Marin almost moved past him too. Then she heard it. Not a gasp, not a cough. A silence that did not belong in a room with a living man in it. The kind of silence that lived in her memory from another life, one she had spent years trying to forget. She turned back before her mind had even finished the thought, because some part of her had heard that exact silence before, in the back of a truck, in a stairwell in a country she was never allowed to name, and it had never once meant nothing. His lips were changing color. His chest was not moving. No monitor had caught it yet. No alarm had sounded. In the chaos of the pileup, no one else in that room had noticed that a Navy SEAL, 2 beds down from the loudest doctor in Cleveland, had stopped breathing in complete silence. Marin's hands stopped trembling. Silent choking is one of the most dangerous medical events precisely because it does not look dramatic. Most people imagine choking as loud and violent, full of coughing and gasping, but a complete airway obstruction is almost the opposite. When an object fully blocks the trachea, no air can pass in either direction, which means there is no cough, no wheeze, no cry for help. The body goes into a strange, terrifying stillness. Within seconds, a person may instinctively grab at their own throat, a universal and involuntary signal of choking. But if no one is looking at that exact moment, the signal disappears into the noise of a busy room. Within roughly 1 minute without oxygen, the lips and fingertips begin to turn blue or gray, a sign known as cyanosis. Within 3 to 4 minutes, the brain begins to suffer real damage from lack of oxygen. This is why emergency responders describe silence, not noise, as the true emergency. The maneuver used to reverse this was developed by an American thoracic surgeon named Dr. Henry Heimlich in 1974. Before his research, the accepted response to choking was to strike the victim firmly on the back, based on the assumption that impact alone could dislodge an object. Heimlich studied the mechanics of the airway and argued that back blows were often useless and sometimes dangerous, since they could drive an object deeper into the throat instead of clearing it. He proposed a different method entirely, using the residual air already trapped in the lungs below the blockage. By applying firm, upward, inward pressure just above the navel, a rescuer could compress the diaphragm and force that trapped air upward through the windpipe in a sudden burst, creating an artificial cough strong enough to physically eject the obstruction. His findings spread quickly through the following decade, taught informally in restaurants and community centers across the country, before becoming official protocol for the American Red Cross and later the American Heart Association. It remains one of the only medical procedures named directly after the person who invented it, a distinction earned because it fundamentally changed emergency response and saved an extraordinary number of lives in the decades since. Maren moved before she had time to think about moving. She stepped behind the stretcher and wrapped both arms around his torso from behind, her hands finding the space just above his navel, with a certainty that belonged to someone who had done this before, in far worse places than a hospital corner. Her fist formed on instinct, her other hand wrapped over it, fingers locking. She planted one foot forward for leverage and drove her hands inward and upward in a single sharp motion. Nothing. She adjusted her grip half an inch higher and tried again, harder this time. Her jaw tight, her breathing controlled. The rest of the room a blur of noise she had already tuned out. A tech walking past froze mid-step. A resident turned, confused, then stopped talking entirely. Somewhere behind her, Dr. Reed's voice cut off mid-sentence. Third thrust. His body jerked forward against her arms, and a small object came loose from his throat, clattering somewhere near the floor. His chest expanded in one violent, desperate pull of air. Color rushed back into his lips in real time, blue-gray fading into something closer to human. His eyes opened, unfocused, then sharpened, locking onto the ceiling, then onto the small woman still braced behind him with her arms wrapped around his ribs. The room went silent in a different way now. Not the silence of neglect, the silence of shock. Dr. Reed stood frozen near the nurse's station, a chart still open in his hand, his mouth slightly parted. Two techs stared at Maren like they were seeing her for the first time, which, in a way, they were. The patient, still catching his breath, lifted a hand weakly toward his own throat, then toward her, as if to check that what just happened had actually happened. Maren straightened, stepped back, and immediately reached for the call button, her voice steady and clipped as she rattled off vitals and instructions to the nearest nurse like she had done it 1,000 times before. Her hands, moments ago wrapped around a dying man's ribs, were now perfectly still. Nobody in that hallway said a word for several seconds. Dr. Reed finally found his voice. It came out sharper than he meant it to, defensive in a way that surprised even him. "You never looked at me." "You only looked down," Maren thought, but did not say, because the thought was not about him choking. It was about every hallway conversation, every correction in front of residents, every time he had made her feel small enough to disappear. What she said out loud was simpler. He was not getting air. Now he is. The next few minutes blurred into procedure. A cardiac monitor was wheeled over. A resident finally remembered to call for oxygen support. Someone paged respiratory therapy, 3 minutes too late to matter, though nobody said that part out loud. Maren worked through it all with the same clipped efficiency, checking his pulse, checking his pupils, checking the small dislodged object now sitting in a kidney basin on the counter, a fragment of hard candy he must have been sucking on to keep his mouth from drying out during the ambulance ride. Small enough to seem harmless, small enough that nobody had thought to ask. Dr. Reed recovered his voice somewhere around the 4th minute, though it came out thinner than his usual tone, stripped of its practiced condescension. "Someone document this properly," he said to no one in particular, already reaching for his own clipboard, already rehearsing how this would read in his version of the incident report. Myron said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that men like Reed needed the story to belong to them, and arguing over ownership of a moment like this one was a fight that cost more than it was worth. What mattered was the man breathing again in front of her, blinking up at the ceiling tiles like he was trying to remember which country he was in. "You are okay," she told him quietly, her voice dropping into something gentler than the tone she used with staff. "You are safe. You are at a hospital in Cleveland. You had something caught in your airway. It is out now." He turned his head slightly, taking her in for the first time with something sharper than confusion. His eyes moved over her face, then down to her hands, still faintly trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. A small, human detail that did not match the certainty of what those hands had just done. "Who are you?" he rasped. "Your nurse," she said, already reaching for her stethoscope again. "Let us make sure everything sounds the way it should." He did not push the question further, not yet, though something in his expression told her he intended to. By the time the immediate crisis passed and the room settled into the low hum of recovery monitoring, word had already started moving through the department, the way word always did in hospitals, faster than any official channel, quieter than any announcement. 2 techs who had watched it happen described it differently to 3 separate co-workers within the hour, each version slightly more dramatic than the last, though none of them managed to capture the detail that mattered most. It was not that she had known what to do. Plenty of staff at Liberty Cross knew the maneuver. It was the speed. The certainty. The complete absence of the small hesitation that even trained professionals carried in the half-second before committing to force against another human body. She had not looked around for permission. She had not looked around for backup. Her body had simply moved. The way a person moves when their instincts have already decided the answer before their mind finishes the question. Word of what happened in Bed 4 spread through the department in the particular way rumors spread inside hospitals. Quietly at first, then all at once. By the time Marin finished her charting, 3 separate nurses had found excuses to walk past that hallway just to look at her, the way people look at something they cannot quite explain. A younger nurse named Priya, barely 2 years out of school, and still soft enough to say what everyone else was thinking, caught up with her near the supply closet. "That was insane," Priya said, keeping her voice low. "I have done the training on a mannequin 100 times. I have never actually seen anyone do it like that. You did not even look scared." Marin offered a small, tired smile, the kind she had perfected over 18 months of making herself smaller than she actually was. "Training kicks in," she said. "That is all it was." Priya did not look entirely convinced, but she let it go, the way most people at Liberty Cross would learn to let things go over the following days. Choosing comfort over curiosity because the alternative required confronting how little they actually knew about the woman who had spent a 1.5 years refilling supply carts and eating lunch alone in her car. Dr. Reed, for his part, spent the rest of his shift unusually quiet, a silence that unsettled the staff far more than his usual volume ever had. He signed off on charts without his typical commentary. He avoided the hallway near Bed 4 entirely, taking a longer route around the nurses' station, rather than walk past the spot where he had stood frozen, clipboard in hand, while a nurse he had mocked less than an hour earlier saved a man's life in front of him. It was not guilt, exactly. Guilt would have required Reed to believe he had done something wrong, and men like him rarely arrived at that conclusion without considerable outside pressure. What kept him quiet was something closer to confusion, the uncomfortable sensation of a hierarchy he had built his entire identity around suddenly refusing to hold its shape. By the end of the shift, Marin had almost convinced herself the day might simply fade into department gossip and nothing more. The kind of story that got exaggerated at the nurses' station for a week before everyone moved on to the next crisis. She almost believed that walking out to her car in the cold Cleveland evening would be the end of it. She was wrong, and some quiet, watchful part of her, the part that had never fully stopped scanning rooms for exits and threats even 18 months into civilian life, already suspected as much. Word moved through Liberty Cross faster than any alarm system could. By the time the federal liaison team confirmed a name for the patient, 3 other men in plain civilian clothes had already walked through the ambulance bay doors like they owned the building, moving with a kind of quiet authority that made hospital security step aside without being asked. The one in front was tall, sunburned despite the Cleveland cold, with a jaw that looked permanently clenched and eyes that swept the room in a single pass, cataloging exits, staff, and threats before he had said a single word. His name, according to the clipped federal paperwork that followed him everywhere, was Bishop. His actual rank was not on that paperwork. He found the room in under a minute. Atlas was sitting upright now, an oxygen line clipped beneath his nose more out of hospital procedure than necessity, arguing quietly with a nurse about whether he was allowed to leave against medical advice. Bishop took one look at him, exhaled something that was almost a laugh, and gripped his uninjured shoulder hard enough to communicate relief without saying the word. "You look like hell," Bishop said. "Feels better than a minute ago," Atlas answered, his voice rough. "Ask her." He nodded toward the hallway, where Marin was updating a chart outside the room, her posture back to its usual curve, shoulders low, eyes on the paper in front of her, as if the last 20 minutes had not happened at all. Bishop turned. He studied her the way operators studied things, without pretending not to. Petite. Blue scrubs a size too big. Hair falling loose from a ponytail that had given up sometime during the pileup. Nothing about her read as remarkable, which was exactly the kind of detail that made men like Bishop pay closer attention, not less. He walked over, positioned himself just inside her field of view, and asked the only question that mattered. "What did you do back there?" "Standard response to an obstructed airway," Marin said, not looking up from the chart. "Abdominal thrusts. He is stable now." Bishop did not move. "That is not what I am asking," he said. "I am asking who taught you to do it that clean, that fast, with zero hesitation, while a doctor twice your seniority stood there doing nothing." Marin's pen paused for half a second. Only half a second. Then it kept moving. "Nursing school," she said. Bishop almost smiled. "Almost." "Those are not a nurse's hands," he said quietly, close enough that only she could hear it. "That is battlefield training. I have seen it exactly twice in my life. Once in a combat hospital in a country I am not allowed to name, and once just now." Marin finally looked up. For one full second, something flickered behind her gray-blue eyes, something old and careful and controlled, the kind of look that measured a threat before deciding whether it was one. Then it was gone, replaced by the same tired, unremarkable exhaustion every nurse on shift wore by hour 8. "I need to finish this chart," she said, and walked away before he could ask anything else. Bishop watched her go, arms crossed, jaw working slowly, already certain of something he had no proof for yet. The two men behind Bishop introduced themselves only by first names, which in Marin's experience meant they had no intention of being remembered at all. One carried a laptop case that looked heavier than laptop cases usually did. The other stood by the door for the entire conversation and never once sat down, his eyes tracking every person who walked past in the hallway outside. "Federal liaison," the hospital administrator explained to the department at large, though the explanation answered almost nothing and raised considerably more questions than it settled. "Classified transport. Need-to-know basis." The kind of phrases that made regular staff members lower their voices without quite understanding why. Atlas, once his name was finally used instead of a bed number, turned out to be considerably less intimidating than his file suggested. At least once the oxygen line came off, and the color fully returned to his face. He had the dry, exhausted humor of a man who had been through worse than a single bad afternoon, and refused to treat this one as anything special. "I have survived 2 deployments, a helicopter hard landing, and my own team's cooking," he told the nurse checking his vitals an hour later. "Almost choking on a butterscotch candy in a Cleveland hospital was not on my list of acceptable ways to go." The nurse laughed, despite herself. Marin, charting quietly at the counter nearby, allowed herself the smallest flicker of a smile, the first genuine one anyone at Liberty Cross had seen from her in weeks. Bishop caught it. Bishop caught everything. He waited until the room cleared before approaching her again, this time without the sharp edge of interrogation in his voice, replaced instead by something quieter, more deliberate. "I looked at the personnel file the hospital keeps on you," he said. "Standard background check, nothing invasive. Nursing degree from a state school. 2 years at a regional hospital in Ohio before transferring here 18 months ago. Clean record. No disciplinary flags. No standout commendations either, which is interesting on its own, considering what I watched you do yesterday." Marin kept her eyes on the chart in front of her. "Some people are just good under pressure," she said. Some people are trained to be good under pressure, Bishop corrected gently. There is a difference, and I have spent my entire career learning to spot it. The way you moved was not adrenaline. Adrenaline makes hands shake, makes people overcorrect, makes even skilled professionals hesitate for half a second while their brain catches up to what their body is doing. You did not have that half second. You had already decided before your body finished turning around. Marin finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he had walked into the department. Is there a reason you are building a case against a nurse who saved your friend's life? She asked, her tone even, carefully controlled. Bishop almost smiled again. No case, he said. Just a question I intend to keep asking until I get an honest answer. And for what it is worth, I do not think you are hiding something dangerous. I think you are hiding something you worked very hard to leave behind. I have met enough people like that to recognize the shape of it from across a room. He left it there, respectfully, though the weight of the observation settled over her long after he walked away. A small crack in the careful wall she had spent 6 years building around the woman she used to be. By the following morning, Dr. Marcus Reed had rebuilt his composure into something resembling authority again, which meant, predictably, that he needed someone smaller to stand on to prove it. He found Marin in the supply room, restocking gauze with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and closed the door behind him with a little more force than necessary. That stunt yesterday could have killed him, Reed said. You are not certified for that level of intervention without a physician present. I could have your license reviewed. Marin did not stop stacking supplies. He was not breathing, she said. There was no time to find a physician. There is always time to follow protocol, Reed snapped. What you did was reckless. It was showing off. And frankly, it embarrassed every actual medical professional standing in that room. This was the version of Reed she knew best. The one who needed an audience of exactly one to feel powerful. The one who confused cruelty for authority because no one at Liberty Cross had ever pushed back hard enough to teach him otherwise. Marin set down the box in her hands, finally turning to face him fully, her expression unreadable. He is alive, she said simply. That was the job. Reed opened his mouth to respond, but the door behind him opened first. Bishop stood in the frame, arms loose at his sides in a way that somehow read as more dangerous than clenched fists would have. His eyes moving from Reed to Marin, and back again with the unhurried patience of a man who had walked into far worse rooms than a hospital supply closet. Doctor, Bishop said, voice pleasant, almost friendly, which made it worse. My understanding is that man in bed 4 is currently breathing because of her, not because of hospital protocol. I would think carefully about which one of those facts you want on record. Reed's jaw tightened. He looked between the federal credentials clipped to Bishop's belt and the quiet, immovable calm in his posture, and made the same calculation every man like him eventually made when actual authority walked into the room. He straightened his coat, muttered something about following up later, and left without waiting for a response. Bishop waited until the door clicked shut before speaking again. You did not answer my question yesterday, he said. I answered it, Marin said. You just did not like the answer. Bishop studied her for a long moment, the kind of silence that in his world usually meant a decision was being made. Atlas is being transferred to a federal facility tomorrow for evaluation, he said finally. Standard procedure after an incident like that. Before he goes, he asked to see the nurse who noticed what nobody else did. Marin's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. I am sure plenty of staff noticed, she said. No, Bishop said, voice quieter now. Just you. In a room full of trained medical professionals staring at monitors, you heard a silence the machines did not catch. That is not luck. That is not nursing school. And I intend to find out exactly what it is, whether you want me to or not. He turned to leave, then paused at the door, glancing back at her with something between suspicion and reluctant respect. For what it is worth, he added, whatever you used to be before those scrubs, it saved his life yesterday. I do not forget that kind of debt. The door closed behind him, and Marin stood alone in the supply room, gauze forgotten in her hands, staring at nothing in particular, aware that somewhere down the hall, a man who noticed everything had just decided to notice her. Word of the confrontation between Bishop and Dr. Reed reached hospital administration by noon, arriving in the sanitized, Careful language administrators always used when they wanted to address a problem without admitting one existed. Marin was called into a small conference room an hour later, where the hospital's chief administrator, a tired-looking man named Whitfield, who avoided conflict the way some people avoided bad weather, sat across from her with a folder he clearly did not want to open. "There is no formal complaint," he said carefully, which surprised her slightly. Dr. Reed raised concerns about protocol adherence, but frankly, given the outcome, and given that a federal liaison officer personally vouched for your actions this morning, legal has advised me to consider this matter closed. Marin said nothing, waiting for the part that always came next in conversations like this one. Whitfield continued, choosing his words with visible caution. "That said, this hospital has procedures for a reason, and I would ask that in the future, if a physician is present, you defer to their judgment on intervention, regardless of circumstances. Even if deferring costs a patient his life," Marin said quietly. Whitfield did not have an answer for that, and they both knew it. He closed the folder without opening it, and dismissed her with the kind of relief, particular to men who preferred problems to disappear rather than resolve. Back on the floor, the department had shifted around her in small, quiet ways that she noticed even if no one said anything directly. A tech who normally ignored her held a door open. A resident who had laughed along with Reed's jokes at her expense last week now avoided eye contact entirely, uncertain how to recalibrate his opinion of someone he had spent months dismissing. Nothing had been said aloud, and yet everything had changed, the way a single crack changes the entire structure of glass even before it shatters. She caught her own reflection in the window of an empty exam room near the end of her shift, oversized blue scrubs, tired eyes, hair falling loose around her face, and for one unguarded moment allowed herself to remember the last time hands like hers had moved that fast for a reason that mattered. A different hospital, a different country, a different name entirely. She pushed the memory down the way she always did, folded it small enough to fit back into the space she kept for it, and continued down the hallway toward her next patient. The same quiet, unremarkable nurse everyone at Liberty Cross believed her to be, at least for one more day. But somewhere down that same hallway, a man with no last name on record and a folder that did not officially exist was already making calls she could not hear, setting in motion a chain of questions that would not stop until someone finally said the word she had spent 6 years trying to bury. Phoenix. That night, alone in the small apartment she rented 10 minutes from the hospital, Marin sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea long gone cold, staring at a phone she had not used to call anyone from her old life in over 5 years. The apartment held almost nothing personal. A single framed photograph face down in a drawer rather than displayed on a shelf. A duffel bag in the closet packed with the kind of efficiency that had nothing to do with moving house and everything to do with muscle memory that never fully switched off. She had built a life designed to be invisible, and for 18 months, it had worked exactly as intended. Bishop's words from that afternoon kept circling back to her, quiet and persistent. "Whatever you used to be before those scrubs, it saved his life yesterday. I do not forget that kind of debt." Debts, in her experience, were rarely left unpaid by men like Bishop. Men who noticed everything did not simply notice and walk away. They filed it. They investigated it. They waited for confirmation before they acted, and confirmation had a way of finding people no matter how carefully they buried their old names. She thought about Atlas, still recovering down the hall from a candy that nearly killed him in a hospital that had no idea who either of them really were. She thought about the sound of his silence, the specific, particular absence of noise that only someone trained to expect the worst would ever learn to hear over the ordinary chaos of an emergency room. She had promised herself, 6 years ago, standing in a debrief room she was never allowed to describe to anyone, that she was finished. Finished with call signs and classified transports and the particular weight of being the only person in a room capable of keeping someone alive when everyone else had already given up. She had traded Phoenix for Marin, traded tactical gear for scrubs 2 sizes too big, traded command for quiet, deliberate invisibility, because invisibility, she had believed, was the only version of peace still available to her. Yet here she was, 18 months into that careful reinvention, and one man's chance encounter with a piece of candy had cracked the foundation of it in under 60 seconds. She closed her eyes, exhaled slowly, and did the only thing that had ever steadied her in moments like this one. She counted backward from 10, the way she had taught dozens of younger operators to manage the first wave of panic before it could take root. And by the time she reached one, her hands were steady again, her breathing even, her mind quiet in the particular way that had once made her very good at her job and now made her very good at hiding from it. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would go back to work, refill the supply carts, chart the vitals, keep her eyes low and her shoulders curved, and hope that whatever Bishop intended to do with his suspicions, it would take longer than the world usually allowed people like her. She was wrong about that too, though she would not learn how wrong until 3 days later, when a black federal vehicle pulled into the Liberty Cross parking lot during the middle of her shift, carrying a man she had once called Commander, and a question she had spent 6 years running from finally arrived to collect its answer. 3 days passed the way Marin had hoped they would. Quietly, uneventfully, filled with nothing more dramatic than restocked supply carts and the ordinary rhythm of 12-hour shifts. Atlas had been discharged to a federal medical facility for further evaluation, and with him gone, the department slowly returned to something resembling its usual noise level. Dr. Reed resumed his usual volume, though with noticeably less venom directed at her, a small mercy she recognized for exactly what it was, caution rather than respect. She almost let herself believe the worst of it had passed. On the second day, hospital administration quietly closed the file on the entire incident, a single paragraph buried in a weekly summary report that most staff would never read. Whitfield, the administrator, seemed relieved beyond measure to file the matter under resolved. No further action required, a phrase that in his world functioned as both closure and prayer. He passed Marin once in the hallway and offered a small, awkward nod, the kind reserved for employees whose competence had become slightly too visible for comfort. Priya, the younger nurse who had approached her that first afternoon, found reasons to work near Marin more often after that. Not out of suspicion, but something closer to quiet admiration she did not fully understand yet. "Can I ask you something?" Priya said on the second evening, restocking gauze beside her in companionable silence. "Do you ever think about doing something bigger? Trauma surgery, flight nursing, something with more, I do not know, adrenaline?" Marin considered the question longer than it probably deserved. "I think everyone eventually finds the size of life that fits what they can carry," she said finally. "Bigger is not always better. Sometimes it is just louder." Priya did not fully understand the answer, though something in Marin's tone told her not to push further, and the moment passed, the way most quiet moments at Liberty Cross eventually did, folded into the next task, the next patient, the next 12-hour shift. By the third evening, Marin had convinced herself the strange interruption to her careful, invisible life had run its course. Bishop had not returned. No further questions had surfaced. Atlas's transfer paperwork had processed without incident, at least according to the version of events available to hospital staff, which, she reminded herself, was rarely the complete version of anything involving federal transport. She should have trusted that instinct more than she did. The black federal vehicle arrived on a Thursday afternoon, sliding into the ambulance bay with a precision that immediately set every experienced nurse on edge, because vehicles that parked like that rarely brought good news. Bishop stepped out first, jaw set, eyes scanning the entrance before he had fully closed the door behind him. 2 other men followed, both wearing the same carefully unremarkable civilian clothes that somehow still managed to look like a uniform. Marin spotted them from the nurse's station and felt something cold settle low in her stomach. The particular stillness that came from recognizing a threat before her conscious mind had finished processing it. Bishop walked directly to her, ignoring the charge nurse's attempt to intercept him with the usual visitor protocol. "We have a situation," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. Atlas's evaluation flagged something in his transport file, a discrepancy in the manifest from 3 days ago. Someone tampered with his classified movement records between the accident site and this hospital. Someone wanted his location scrubbed from federal tracking during the exact window he was choking to death in your ER. Marin's expression did not change, though her mind moved fast, cataloging implications with the same cold efficiency it once reserved for briefings in rooms with no windows. "You think it was deliberate?" she said. "I think a man carrying operational intelligence relevant to an active investigation nearly died in a random Cleveland emergency room 48 hours after his transport paperwork went missing from a secure federal system," Bishop said. "I do not believe in coincidences that convenient." He glanced around the department, lowering his voice further as a passing tech moved out of earshot. "There is more," he said. The candy that lodged in his throat did not arrive by accident either. Our lab flagged an unusual residue on the wrapper, something that would have caused mild throat swelling on its own even without a physical obstruction. Someone wanted him vulnerable during transport, and someone very nearly succeeded, in a building full of people trained to save lives. Maren felt the old familiar chill settle into her spine, the sensation of a mission briefing beginning whether she had agreed to attend it or not. "Who else knows he is here?" she asked. "Fewer people than should," Bishop said grimly, "which means someone with access leaked it anyway." Before she could respond further, the ambulance bay doors opened again, and this time it was not federal agents walking through them. 3 men in maintenance uniforms crossed the lobby with the unhurried, deliberate pace of people who wanted to look bored, though Maren clocked the earpiece on the tallest one within 2 seconds, the kind of detail an ordinary nurse would never have noticed, and a trained operator could not help but see. "Bishop," she said quietly, not moving her eyes from the men. "Those are not hospital maintenance staff." Bishop followed her gaze, and his posture shifted instantly from federal liaison to something considerably more dangerous. "How certain are you?" he asked, already reaching for the radio clipped inside his jacket. "Certain enough that I would already be moving if you were not standing next to me," she said. The memory came fully formed, the way certain memories always did, arriving whole instead of in fragments. Every detail intact, no matter how many years she had spent trying to file it somewhere, she would not have to revisit it. The vehicle had been moving at close to 60 miles an hour, down a rutted supply road, headlights off per protocol, the darkness broken only by intermittent flashes from the exchange of gunfire somewhere behind them. The man on the floor of that vehicle had taken a round through the upper thigh, close enough to the femoral artery that every jolt of the vehicle threatened to finish what the bullet had started. She remembered the specific texture of his uniform under her hands, soaked through, remembered the particular sound his breathing made as shock began setting in, shallow and fast and utterly silent in the way that mattered most. There had been no monitors in that vehicle, no overhead lighting steady enough to properly assess his color, only her hands, her training, and the absolute certainty that the next 90 seconds would decide whether he lived long enough to see a real hospital. She had packed the wound with what she had, applied pressure with a precision that came from muscle memory built through repetition. Most people would never have to survive, and talked to him the entire time in a low, steady voice that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with keeping him conscious long enough to matter. "Stay with me," she had told him then. The same 3 words she would find herself thinking, though not saying, 3 days ago in a Cleveland emergency room while a different man's chest refused to move. He had survived. Most of them had, over 4 years that blurred together into a single continuous exercise in controlled, focused defiance against the particular arithmetic of violence and blood loss. It was the ones who had not survived that stayed with her longest, their faces sharper in memory than the ones she had saved. An unfair weighting of grief that she suspected every medic in her position eventually learned to carry without ever fully making peace with it. She had left that life for reasons that were entirely her own, reasons that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a specific kind of exhaustion that came from being the only person standing between someone and the worst possible outcome, over and over, for years, without ever being permitted to fully process any single loss before the next one demanded her attention. Liberty Cross had offered something different, slower, quieter, a version of medicine that came with backup, with monitors, with actual walls between her and the violence she had spent 4 years absorbing directly into her own hands. It had worked, for 18 months, exactly as she had hoped it would, until a piece of candy lodged in the wrong throat at the wrong moment, and the quiet, careful woman she had built herself into discovered that the silence she had once feared most was also the only sound in the world she had ever truly known how to answer. While Bishop's men fanned out to establish a perimeter around the ambulance bay, Maren found herself standing very still for a moment, caught in a memory she had not let surface in years. She had been 26 the first time she watched a man's lips change color in front of her, in a stairwell somewhere she was never permitted to name, 3 floors below ground level, with no equipment beyond a field kit, and the certainty that if she hesitated even a second, the man in front of her would not survive long enough for proper medical transport to arrive. She remembered the particular quality of that silence, too. The way real emergencies rarely announce themselves with noise. The way the body simply began failing in the quietest possible way, as if death itself preferred not to draw attention, until it was already too late to stop. She had saved him. She had saved most of them. Over 4 years of deployments, she was still not permitted to fully describe even to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, though the ones she had lost stayed with her longer and louder than the ones she had not. It was one of those losses, a young operator barely out of his 20s, that had finally sent her looking for an exit from that life entirely. The specific weight of a name she still could not say out loud without her throat tightening involuntarily. She had told herself, walking away from that life, that quiet civilian work would be enough, that refilling supply carts and taking blood pressure readings would give her hands something gentler to do, something that did not require her to measure a stranger's life in seconds and instinct. For 18 months at Liberty Cross, that had almost been true. Almost. Bishop's voice pulled her back to the present, sharp and immediate. "Ellis," he said, using the only name he currently had for her. "Are you with me?" "I am with you," she said, and meant it, though some quiet, watchful part of her recognized the uncomfortable truth settling into place. The version of herself she had spent 6 years trying to bury had never actually left. It had simply been waiting, patient and unhurried, for a silence loud enough to call it back out. The lockdown happened faster than hospital protocol had ever accounted for, mostly because Moran initiated it herself, 3 full seconds before Bishop's team could react, using a maintenance override code that should not have existed anywhere in her nursing credentials. Doors sealed. "Wing B," she said, her voice suddenly carrying an authority that made the charge nurse beside her freeze mid-protest. "Get every ambulatory patient into interior rooms, away from windows and corridors. Now." "Where did you learn that override code?" the charge nurse asked, stunned. There was no time to answer. The 3 men in maintenance uniforms had already split up, one moving toward the records room where Atlas's discharge paperwork still sat in a locked cabinet, the others fanning toward the pediatric wing, where a visiting senator's grandchild was currently recovering from a routine appendectomy, a detail that had been quietly flagged in the hospital's security briefing that morning and clearly noticed by people who should never have had access to it. Bishop's men moved fast, but hospitals were not built for tactical engagement, full of civilians, fragile equipment, and corridors never designed with cover in mind. It was Marin who called out the correct intercept point, cutting through the confusion with 3 short sentences that made both federal agents look at her twice. "Records room has 1 entrance. Force him toward pediatric and he funnels through radiology. I can get you eyes on that hallway in under a minute." Bishop did not ask how. There was no time left for questions, only trust, and something in her voice made trust the easier choice. The hospital's overhead announcement system, normally reserved for mundane paging, crackled once with a coded phrase that meant nothing to ordinary staff and everything to trained personnel, a phrase Marin had inserted into the system years ago, during an earlier consultation Bishop's team did not yet know she had quietly assisted with. Doors along Wing B sealed in sequence, a cascading series of clicks that echoed down the corridor like dominoes falling in reverse. A young resident, caught in the open hallway when the doors began locking, froze in confusion until Marin's voice cut through the intercom system. Calm, precise, unmistakably in command. "Get into the nearest room. Lock the door behind you. Stay away from the corridor side wall." He obeyed without questioning why a nurse was suddenly giving orders over hospital-wide intercom, some instinctive part of him recognizing authority regardless of the uniform delivering it. She moved through the hospital the way she had once moved through buildings that were never meant to be survived. Low, efficient, reading angles and sightlines instead of hallway numbers. Her oversized scrubs no longer looking oversized so much as simply irrelevant to the person wearing them. A young nurse froze near the radiology door, and Marin redirected her without breaking stride, her tone calm enough to cut through panic without raising her voice at all. "Get behind the lead wall. Stay low. You will be fine." Meanwhile, the man assigned to the records room found the locked cabinet exactly where Bishop's earlier intelligence had flagged it, though he had not accounted for the possibility that hospital security cameras, quietly repositioned days earlier at Marin's private suggestion, following her earlier conversation with Bishop, now covered an angle the original blueprint never included. Federal agents converged on that position within 90 seconds, catching him mid-attempt at the cabinet lock. His surprise evident even through the maintenance uniform meant to make him invisible. The man heading for the pediatric wing rounded the corner into radiology exactly where she predicted, and found himself facing not a frightened nurse, but a woman standing perfectly still, weight balanced, hands loose at her sides, in a stance that had nothing to do with nursing school. He hesitated for half a second. The same half second that had cost countless men their advantage against operators trained to exploit exactly that pause. It was enough. She closed the distance before he could reset his grip, using the confined hallway itself as a weapon, redirecting his own forward momentum into the wall hard enough to end the confrontation without a single wasted motion. His shoulder struck the corner of a supply cart hard enough to knock the wind from him, and before he could recover his footing, she had already secured his wrist behind his back, pinning him against the wall with the kind of controlled, economical pressure that ended fights before they properly began. Bishop's men arrived 4 seconds later to find him already restrained, disarmed, and considerably more confused about his afternoon than he had planned to be. The third man, cornered near the ambulance bay by 2 federal agents who had anticipated his retreat route with unusual precision, surrendered without resistance the moment he realized the building itself had turned against him. Every exit anticipated, every hallway monitored, every advantage he believed he carried quietly stripped away by someone he never once saw coming. Bishop stood in the doorway of radiology, breathing hard from the sprint across the wing, staring at the small woman in bright blue scrubs standing over a subdued intruder twice her size. "Explain that," he said, once his breathing steadied. Marin straightened, brushing a strand of loose hair from her face, and for the first time since she had transferred to Liberty Cross 18 months ago, did not bother lowering her eyes. "Later," she said. "Get him processed. Then we talk." The all-clear came 15 minutes later, delivered through the same intercom system that had, for one strange and unforgettable afternoon, briefly belonged to a woman none of them had truly known until that moment. Staff emerged from locked rooms slowly, cautiously, exchanging confused glances and half-formed questions that would circulate through the department for weeks afterward, though none of the official reports would ever fully capture what those closest to it had actually witnessed. Whitfield spent the following 2 hours fielding calls he had never trained for, starting with a visibly shaken aide from the senator's office, demanding to know how armed intruders had gotten within 2 hallways of a sitting senator's grandchild, and ending with a quiet, carefully worded call from a federal press liaison, instructing him, politely but unmistakably, that none of what happened that afternoon would appear in any public record, ever, under any circumstances. He found Marin afterward in the break room, still in her scrubs, drinking coffee that had clearly gone cold an hour earlier. "Do you have any idea what almost happened today?" he said, though the accusation in his voice had softened considerably from where it usually sat with her. "I have a fairly precise idea, actually," Marin said. Whitfield sat down across from her, rubbing his face with both hands in the universal gesture of a man reconsidering every assumption he had built his career on. "The senator's office wants to send a formal thank you," he said, "to the hospital. Federal liaison wants it kept quiet instead, for reasons I am apparently not cleared to fully understand. And somewhere in the middle of that, I have an employee who single-handedly organized a hospital-wide lockdown using an override code that, according to my own IT department, should not exist in any system they manage." "I can explain the code," she said. "I am almost afraid to hear it," Whitfield admitted. "It exists because 6 months ago, after reviewing this hospital's emergency response protocols on my own time, I flagged 3 vulnerabilities to your security team anonymously," Marin said. "One of them involved exactly this scenario. Nobody asked who submitted the report. I assumed nobody would ever need to know." Whitfield stared at her for a long moment, something between disbelief and reluctant respect, settling into his tired expression. "You have been quietly fixing this hospital's security gaps for 6 months, he said slowly, and none of us noticed. "That tends to be the pattern with me," Marin said, without a trace of self-pity in her voice, simply a tired, plain statement of fact. Whitfield exhaled slowly, the particular exhale of an administrator recalculating an entire employee file in real time. "Whatever budget I need to find to keep you doing that officially," he said, "I will find it." Priya was 2 rooms away when the intercom crackled with Marin's voice, and for a moment she simply stood frozen, certain she had misheard the tone of quiet, absolute command coming from someone she had spent the last 3 days quietly admiring for entirely different reasons. "Get into the nearest room," the voice repeated. "Lock the door. Stay away from the corridor sidewall." Priya obeyed instantly, pulling a frightened elderly patient with her into the nearest supply closet and locking the door with hands that shook more than she wanted to admit. Through the thin wall, she could hear footsteps moving with a speed and precision that did not belong to hospital staff, followed by a sudden sharp scuffle that ended almost as quickly as it began. She counted her own breaths the way she had been taught in nursing school for managing patient panic. Though nothing in nursing school had prepared her for crouching in a supply closet, while a lockdown she did not understand, unfolded somewhere just beyond the door. When the all-clear finally came, delivered again in that same steady voice over the intercom, Priya emerged slowly, her elderly patient gripping her arm for support, both of them blinking in the sudden brightness of the hallway lights. She found Marin near radiology 20 minutes later, calm, composed, giving quiet instructions to a federal agent as though the last half hour had been an ordinary Tuesday, rather than an attempted intercept of classified transport intelligence inside a civilian hospital. "That was you," Priya said, still slightly breathless, on the intercom. "That was your voice." Marin met her eyes, and for once did not immediately look away or offer a deflection. "It was," she said simply. Priya opened her mouth to ask a dozen questions at once, then closed it again, some instinct telling her that whatever answer existed behind that steady, unshaken calm was not one that would arrive easily or all at once. "I am glad you are the one who was here today," Priya said instead, quietly, and meant every word of it. "So am I," Marin admitted, surprising herself with how true the sentence felt once she said it out loud. They talked in the same conference room where hospital administration had once tried to quietly bury a complaint against her, though this time the only other people present were Bishop, a senior federal investigator flown in on short notice, and Dr. Reed, summoned by an administrator desperate to understand how his hospital had briefly become the site of an attempted federal intercept operation. Marin sat across from all of them, spine straight, hands folded, the posture of someone who had briefed rooms exactly like this one more times than she could count in another life. "My name was not always Marin Ellis," she said, and the room went silent in the particular way. Rooms go silent when the truth finally arrives after everyone has spent days circling it. 6 years ago, I held a different rank, and a different name existed for the version of me who held it. My team called me Phoenix. Bishop closed his eyes briefly, less from surprise, and more from the quiet satisfaction of a suspicion finally confirmed. I led a joint special operations medical unit attached to a task force most of you will never see documentation for, Marin continued. My job was keeping operators alive in conditions no civilian hospital could imagine, often with nothing but what I carried on my back and whatever training my hands remembered under pressure. I left that life 6 years ago for reasons that are mine alone, and I built a quiet one here instead, because quiet was the only kind of peace I believed I still deserved. The federal investigator, a woman named Colonel Draper who had said almost nothing through the entire briefing, leaned forward slightly. For the record, Draper said, your former service record has been requested for cross-reference. It will confirm everything you have said, and considerably more that this room does not need to hear today. Marin nodded once, acknowledging the confirmation without needing to see the file herself. Dr. Reed, silent for most of the entire conversation, stared at her with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something closer to shame. The man you intervened on 3 days ago, Bishop said quietly, filling in the piece she had left unspoken. Atlas served under a commanding officer whose call sign was Phoenix, during a rotation that still carries redacted status in 3 separate federal systems. He recognized something in the way you moved, even half-conscious. He simply did not have the words for it until now. He asked to thank you personally, Bishop added, formally, once his evaluation clears. He said very few people alive taught him what silence like that actually meant, and fewer still would recognize it fast enough to matter. Draper cleared her throat, addressing the room with the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to closing files rather than opening new ones. The men attempting to reach Atlas's records had been tracked to a private contracting firm with interests in the same operation his intelligence threatened to expose, an investigation that would now proceed considerably faster thanks to the intercept inside Liberty Cross. There is a formal commendation process available to you, Draper said to Marin, if you want it. Quiet, sealed, but real. Most people in your position take it. I do not need a medal for doing what I would have done regardless, Marin said. What I need is for this hospital to understand that the people it overlooks are sometimes the exact people keeping it standing. Dr. Reed finally spoke, his voice smaller than the hospital had ever heard it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Several, actually." Maren studied him for a long moment. The same man who had spent 18 months making her feel small enough to disappear now looked for the first time genuinely uncertain of his own footing. "You do not owe me anything," she said finally. "You owe every nurse you have ever spoken to like that an apology, whether they happen to have a classified past or not. That is the only lesson worth taking from this." Reed had no answer for that. For once, he did not try to find one. Bishop leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than it had been in any of their previous conversations. "I have one more question," he said, "if you are willing to answer it. Why choose this hospital out of every civilian posting available to someone with your discharge classification?" Maren considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because nobody here needed saving in the way I used to define saving," she said. "I needed a place where the stakes were smaller, where I could still use my hands to help people without the weight of an entire mission, depending on whether my hands stayed steady enough. Liberty Cross gave me exactly that, until it did not, and I discovered the weight follows you regardless of how small you try to make the room." Draper made a note on the file in front of her, though her eyes stayed on Maren rather than the paper. "Your former commanding officer's report describes you as the steadiest medic he ever served alongside," Draper said. "His exact words, if you want them, are that Phoenix could keep a man's heart beating through sheer force of refusal to let it stop." Maren's composure held, though something behind her eyes flickered briefly at hearing a version of her old commander's voice repeated back to her secondhand. "He always did exaggerate for morale," she said quietly. Draper allowed the smallest suggestion of a smile. "He does not exaggerate in classified reports," she said. "Those tend to be the most honest documents in existence, precisely because nobody expects the public to ever read them." Reed, still visibly shaken by the entire revelation, finally found a version of his voice that did not sound entirely hollow. "I built my entire reputation in this department on being the person who never got things wrong," he said, more to the room than to any one person in particular. "I do not think I ever considered what that cost the people around me who could not afford to be wrong either." Quietly, without anyone noticing the weight of it. "That is the first honest thing you have said since I met you," Maren told him, not unkindly. Reed absorbed that without argument. A small, uncomfortable nod, the closest thing to acknowledgement he seemed able to offer in the moment. In the weeks that followed, Liberty Cross Trauma Institute changed in small, quiet ways that had nothing to do with press releases or federal commendations, most of which were sealed anyway. Reed's public humiliations of junior staff simply stopped, a shift the entire department noticed without anyone needing to explain why. He began arriving earlier, staying later, correcting mistakes in private conversations rather than public ones, a transformation slow enough that no one trusted it fully at first, though it held steady week after week regardless of whether anyone was watching. The hospital administrator quietly implemented new emergency response training, led, at Bishop's specific recommendation, by a nurse whose full credentials remained classified, but whose competence no longer needed federal paperwork to prove itself. Staff signed up in numbers that surprised even Whitfield, drawn less by curiosity about her past, and more by a simple, practical hunger to learn what she clearly already knew. Maren was offered a full return to active operational status, a formal reinstatement of the rank and name she had left behind 6 years earlier. Draper delivered the offer personally, in the same conference room, with the same careful neutrality she brought to everything. "The unit would have you back tomorrow," Draper said, "full rank restored. Most people do not get that kind of second chance." Maren considered it for exactly as long as courtesy required, and no longer. "I already have the life I chose," she said. "It just took the right silence to remind me why." She declined, gently but firmly, choosing instead to remain exactly where she was, in scrubs a size too big, in a hospital that finally understood what it had been underestimating for 18 months. She did agree to one condition, quietly, without ceremony. Twice a month, she would train hospital staff in trauma response methods most civilian nurses never encountered, sharing exactly as much of her past as necessary, and not one detail more. Priya was the first to sign up for that training, arriving early on the first session with a notebook already half filled with questions. "I knew there was more to you than supply carts," Priya said, grinning. "There is more to everyone than what people assume walking past them," Maren answered. "That is usually the whole problem. Atlas visited once more before his transfer cleared, finding her alone in the same supply room where Reed had once accused her of showing off. "Command suits you better than scrubs," he said, extending his hand. Marin shook it, something almost like a real smile crossing her face. She was never hiding weakness, she told him. She was hiding command. There is a difference, and it took the right silence to finally prove it. Atlas nodded once, the kind of nod exchanged between people who understood exactly what that sentence cost her to say out loud. "For what it is worth," he added at the door. "Bishop already told the team. Nobody underestimates a Cleveland ER again. Not on our watch." Marin laughed, a real one this time, the sound surprising even her. "Tell Bishop I said thank you for noticing what everyone else missed," she said. "It has been a long time since anyone bothered to look that closely." He walked out into a Cleveland afternoon that finally, quietly, belonged to her again, leaving behind a hospital that had learned, in the space of one impossible week, that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one paying attention. The first official training session drew more staff than the conference room could comfortably hold. Nurses and residents alike crowding along the back wall, notebooks balanced on knees, a few off-duty staff having come in on their own time simply to watch. Marin stood at the front of the room in her usual oversized scrubs, though something in her posture had shifted permanently since that Thursday afternoon. Straighter now, steadier, a woman who no longer needed to fold herself smaller to fit expectations that had never actually served her. "The technique you are about to learn takes less than a minute to perform correctly," she told the room, "and it will feel far too simple for how much it actually matters." That gap between how simple it looks and how much it saves is exactly why most people hesitate when it counts. Hesitation is the only real enemy in a moment like this. She walked them through it slowly, deliberately, breaking the motion into pieces small enough for even the newest resident to absorb without panic clouding the details. Recognize the signs. Position your hands correctly. Commit fully to the motion once you decide to act, because a hesitant thrust helps no one. And a committed one, executed even imperfectly, has saved more lives than any hospital could ever properly count. Priya, sitting in the front row, raised her hand. "Does it get easier?" she asked, deciding to move that fast, without waiting for someone else to confirm it is the right call. Marin considered the question with the same care she gave every question that actually mattered. "It does not get easier," she said honestly. "You simply learn to trust that the decision was already the right one, the moment you notice something everyone else missed. The training is not really about your hands. It is about teaching yourself to trust what your hands already know how to do." The room absorbed that in the particular quiet way rooms absorb something true. And for the length of that training session, Liberty Cross Trauma Institute became exactly what Marin had once hoped every hospital could be, a place where the quietest person in the room was finally the one everyone had learned to listen to. Dr. Reed attended that first session too, standing quietly near the back, rather than at his usual position near the front of any room he entered. He said nothing during the training itself, though he stayed after most of the staff had filtered out, watching Marin pack away the training materials with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. "I used to think competence needed an audience to matter," he said finally, not quite meeting her eyes. "Watching you these past few weeks, I am starting to understand it usually works better without one." "That is closer to the truth than most people ever get," Marin said, folding the last training manual into her bag. Reed nodded, lingering a moment longer, then left without needing to say anything further. The kind of silence between them now that no longer required translation. 2 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning she would normally have spent asleep after a night shift, Marin drove 3 hours to a small military cemetery she had visited exactly once before, 6 years earlier, on the day she had made the decision to leave her old life behind entirely. The headstone belonged to the young operator, whose loss had finally broken something loose in her. The one whose name still caught in her throat even now, years and an entire lifetime later. She stood in front of it for a long while, saying nothing out loud, though the silence itself felt different this time than it had on her last visit, lighter somehow, less like punishment and more like a debt finally repaid in full. "I did not run from what happened to you," she said quietly, the words feeling strange after so many years of refusing to say them at all. "I ran from what I thought I deserved after it. There is a difference, and it took a long time and a stranger's silence in an ER for me to finally understand which one was true." She stayed another few minutes, then walked back to her car steadier than she had arrived. The particular kind of steady that only comes after finally setting down a weight carried too long and too quietly to notice how heavy it had become. Back at Liberty Cross the following week, the department had settled into a new rhythm that no longer required her to disappear into it. Dr. Reed, true to the slow, uneven pace of real change, had begun mentoring two of the youngest residents rather than humiliating them, a shift small enough to go unnoticed by anyone who had not witnessed his old behavior firsthand, and significant enough that Priya mentioned it twice in the same week with something like cautious hope. Bishop returned once more before his team's involvement in the case officially closed, finding Marin at the end of a shift, tired in the ordinary way, rather than the guarded way she used to carry exhaustion. The investigation traced back 3 layers deep, he told her. Your intervention did not just save Atlas. It gave us the thread that unraveled an operation that had been quietly bleeding classified intelligence for over a year. That matters more than most people in this hospital will ever know. It mattered enough that a man got to keep breathing, Marin said. That is usually where I stop counting. Bishop studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. For what it is worth, he said, the offer to return stays open. Not today, not this year, maybe never. But it stays open, because people like you do not really retire. You just choose quieter battlefields. Marin considered the hospital around her, the fluorescent lights, the tired nurses at the station, the particular exhausted dignity of a building that spent every single day quietly keeping people alive, without ever asking for recognition. I already found mine, she said. It just took the right kind of silence to remind me I was standing in it the whole time. Bishop nodded slowly, studying her for a moment longer, as though committing the picture in front of him to memory on purpose. A woman standing in fluorescent hospital light. Unremarkable scrubs, steady hands. The closest thing to genuine peace he had witnessed in someone who once carried her particular weight. For what it is worth, he added, before turning toward the doors, Atlas asked me to tell you something if I ever saw you again. He said the strangest part of nearly dying was not the fear of it. It was realizing, right before everything went dark, that some quiet part of him already trusted the room to save him, even before he knew who was in it. Marin felt something settle in her chest at that, warm and unexpected, the particular ache of being recognized for exactly what she had spent 6 years trying to hide. Tell him I am glad his instincts were right, she said quietly. Bishop nodded once more, the closest thing to a farewell either of them needed, and walked out through the same ambulance bay doors that had once brought chaos into her carefully rebuilt life, leaving behind a woman finally, fully at peace, with both names she had ever carried. The end. A final word about the moment that started it all. Every story in this series carries a little truth hidden inside the fiction. And this one carries something worth carrying with you, long after the screen goes dark. What Marin did in that hallway was not something reserved for soldiers, medics, or people with a hidden past. It is one of the simplest, most learnable skills a human being can carry, and it belongs to anyone willing to spend 5 minutes learning it. Choking is quiet. That is the part most people never expect until they see it themselves. There is no dramatic gasping, no scene from a movie. There is only stillness, a hand moving instinctively toward the throat, a face slowly losing its color, and a room full of people who have no idea anything is wrong at all. That silence is the entire emergency, and it is exactly why so many people go untreated for those first, critical seconds, the seconds that matter most. The maneuver itself asks so little of you. Stand behind the person. Wrap your arms around them. Make a fist just above the navel. Grab that fist with your other hand. Pull sharply inward and upward, again and again, without hesitation, until the object clears or help arrives. It takes less time to perform than it took to read this paragraph, and it has saved more lives across dinner tables, playgrounds, and kitchens than almost any other single piece of knowledge an ordinary person can carry. You do not need a military background to save someone's life this way. You do not need years of training, a call sign, or a hidden past. You simply need to know it exists, to recognize the silence for what it is, and to be willing to move the moment you notice it. The same way Marin moved, the same way anyone reading this could move, starting today. Learn it once. Practice it if you can, even just in the air, so your hands remember the shape of it. Teach it to someone you love. You may never need it, But somewhere, someday, in a kitchen or a restaurant or a quiet corner of a room, nobody else is watching closely enough. That knowledge might be the only thing standing between a life continuing and a silence nobody catches in time. Be the one who notices. That is the story of the day. Silence became the loudest sound in the room. If it moved you, hit like, subscribe to Silent Badge's stories, and drop a comment telling us which moment hit hardest, because more stories like hers are already on the way.